She was only 7 years old, her tiny hands gripping a microphone that seemed almost too big for her. The spotlight washed over her small frame, and for a moment the crowd wasn't sure what to expect. Could a child possibly carry the weight of a voice that had defined a generation? Could she sing songs that belonged to the one and only king of rock and roll? Then the first note came, pure, strong, almost haunting. The audience leaned forward, caught off guard by the power that seemed to come from such a fragile body. Every syllable wrapped itself around the words of an Elvis Presley classic, and suddenly it didn't feel like imitation. It felt like something else, like the spirit of Elvis himself was echoing through her voice. But what no one in that audience knew, not yet at least, was that the king himself was closer than anyone realized. And when Elvis Presley heard her when he walked into that room, his reaction would leave everyone stunned. That moment, a 7-year-old child singing her heart out and Elvis Presley's shocking, unforgettable response has become the kind of story people tell decades later. Not just because it was magical, not just because it was surprising, but because it revealed something deeper about the man behind the legend and the little girl who dared to carry his songs into the world. So how did it all happen? How did a young child come to stand at the crossroads of innocence and greatness, with Elvis Presley himself watching from just a few steps away? To understand, we need to step back and see where this story begins. It started long before that little girl walked onto a stage. It began in a small home where music was more than just sound, it was a lifeline. She had grown up in an ordinary family, not rich, not powerful, but filled with love and with records that spun late into the night. Elvis Presley was more than just a voice on the radio to them. He was hope. He was proof that someone humble, someone from a poor background, could rise to extraordinary heights. Her father often told her stories about Elvis, about how he came from Tupelo, Mississippi with nothing but a deep love of gospel and rhythm, about how he worked as a truck driver before anyone knew his name, about how his first recordings didn't just change music, they changed the way people believed in what was possible. For that little girl, Elvis wasn't just a star. He was a mirror of what courage looked like. So while other children hummed nursery rhymes or sang along to cartoon jingles, she gravitated toward something far bigger. At first, it was just humming along quietly to Love Me Tender as her mother did the dishes. Then it became full-out singing, memorizing every word, every rise and fall of his voice. Her parents didn't stop her, they encouraged it. They saw the spark in her eyes, the joy in her smile when she sang. And though she was small, her voice had a depth that shocked even adults. Neighbors would pause outside the window when they heard her singing, some shaking their heads in disbelief. That child, one woman said, has a voice that shouldn't even be possible at her age. But still, the idea of her ever performing in public seemed far away. She was shy, more comfortable singing in her bedroom or for her family, until one day an opportunity came. A local community center was hosting a small talent show. Nothing fancy, just a gathering where kids and adults alike could show off what they loved to do. Most signed up to dance, to recite poems, to juggle, or to sing the popular tunes of the day. But when her parents gently nudged her to put her name on the list, she hesitated. "What if they laugh at me?" she whispered. Her father knelt down, looking her straight in the eyes. "Sweetheart," Elvis himself was laughed at once. People didn't understand him, but he kept singing. And because he did, the whole world listened. "If you sing even just once, you'll see you have nothing to be afraid of." She agreed, reluctantly, nervously, but she agreed. And so the weeks leading up to that night were filled with practice. Every evening after dinner, she would stand in the living room, clutching a hairbrush as a microphone, her parents clapping along as she belted out Elvis songs. Some nights she stumbled, her voice cracking, her eyes filling with tears of frustration, but her mother would wipe them gently and remind her, "Elvis sang from the heart, that's all you have to do." By the time the night of the performance arrived, she was still scared, but also ready. Her outfit was simple, a modest dress, her hair tied neatly with a bow. Nothing about her appearance suggested what was about to happen. The talent show was small, casual, even a little messy. Folding chairs filled the hall, parents whispered excitedly, kids ran around backstage. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect a life-changing moment to unfold. But sometimes history is made in the most unexpected corners. When her turn finally came, she nearly froze. Standing on the stage, staring out at rows of strangers, her legs trembled. For a moment, she thought about running off, about pretending she had forgotten the words. But then she saw her father in the front row, smiling, nodding, mouthing the words, "You can do this." The music began, those familiar opening chords of "Can't Help Falling in Love." And something shifted. The nerves melted, replaced by the sheer love of the song. She closed her eyes and her voice carried out into the room. The audience went still, parents stopped whispering. Even the other kids who had been restless moments earlier turned their heads. There was something uncanny, almost chilling, in how this small child could deliver a voice that seemed far too seasoned, too soulful for her age. And as she reached the chorus, her voice stronger now, people began to exchange glances. It wasn't just talent, it was presence, it was connection, and it was impossible to ignore. What no one knew, not even her family, was that someone else had heard about this little girl. A man whose curiosity had been piqued by whispers that a child could sing his songs like no one else. A man who often slipped into places quietly, without fanfare, just to see things for himself. Elvis Presley. That night, as the little girl sang her heart out, the king himself was closer than anyone imagined. And when he finally revealed himself, when he reacted to her performance, it would become one of the most unforgettable moments of his life and hers. But in this moment, as her song filled the hall, she was just a child singing the music she loved most. A child unaware that history was about to knock on her door. Before that little girl ever stepped onto a stage, before her voice made a room full of strangers go silent, her life was filled with quiet moments that shaped her. To understand why her story matters, and why Elvis Presley's reaction was so powerful, we have to step back and see the world through her eyes. She was a child growing up in a time when music wasn't just entertainment, it was culture, identity, escape. Families gathered around radios, records spun in living rooms, and Elvis Presley's voice poured through homes like sunlight. For her family, those songs weren't just background noise. They were woven into their daily lives, binding them together in joy and in hardship. Her father especially carried Elvis's music like a kind of gospel. He remembered vividly the first time he had seen Elvis on television. The way he shook, the way he smiled, the way he made even the most ordinary people feel extraordinary. He would often tell his daughter, "Elvis came from nothing, sweetheart. He sang because he had to, because music was the only thing that made sense. That's why people loved him, not just for the fame, but because they knew he was real." Those words stuck with her. To a 7-year-old, Elvis wasn't just a man. He was almost like a fairy tale come to life, a poor boy who became a king. And so night after night, she would sit cross-legged on the carpet, staring at the record player as if it were a portal. When the needle touched the vinyl and Elvis's voice filled the room, she felt like the walls disappeared. Like she was standing in front of him, singing with him. She didn't copy him, not exactly. She absorbed him, reshaping every lyric with the raw, unpolished truth of her own child's heart. But the world outside her home wasn't as kind as the world inside. At school, other kids teased her. They didn't understand why she cared so much about old music. Some laughed at her when she hummed Hound Dog at recess. Others told her Elvis was her grandparents' music, not hers. She felt embarrassed sometimes, shrinking away from her classmates, wondering if maybe they were right. And yet, every time she thought about giving up, she would go home, drop the record onto the turntable, and let that voice remind her of why she loved it in the first place. Music didn't judge her. It welcomed her. Still, doubt crept in. She was small, shy, just a child. How could she ever stand in front of people and sing? Who would take her seriously? Her parents saw that conflict in her. They saw her passion, but they also saw her fear. And so they did what Elvis's own mother had done for him years earlier. They reminded her that the gift inside her was worth sharing, no matter who doubted it. Her mother would kneel beside her bed at night and whisper, "Don't be afraid of your own voice. Some people may not understand it, but that doesn't mean it isn't powerful." And her father added the story that stuck with her most, how Elvis himself as a boy had once been laughed at for singing in church. People thought he was strange, too different, too bold, but he kept going, and because he did, the world changed. That story gave her courage. She began singing more boldly at home, no longer hiding her voice behind closed doors. She would sing while helping with chores, sing while walking to school, even sing herself to sleep. And the more she sang, the more her parents knew, someday, somehow, people had to hear her. That chance came when the community announced a small talent showcase. It wasn't a glamorous event, just folding chairs in a hall, kids performing for neighbors, and a handful of local reporters who sometimes wrote about it in the paper. But for her, it might as well have been Madison Square Garden. The moment her parents suggested she perform, fear gripped her again. What if people laughed? What if she froze? What if her voice cracked and she humiliated herself? But her father's words echoed. Elvis kept singing even when people laughed, and look what happened. So she agreed, and from that moment the countdown began. Every night became rehearsal. She practiced in front of her family, her small frame trembling at first but growing steadier with each attempt. She tripped over lyrics some nights, breaking into tears. Other nights she soared, her voice stronger than even she realized, filling the room until her parents applauded with tears in their eyes. But with every rehearsal came tension. Could she really do this on stage in front of strangers? Could she carry Elvis's music without people mocking her? Her mother, sensing her doubts, reminded her, "You're not trying to be Elvis. You're just singing the music you love, that's enough." And yet the stakes felt bigger than just a small performance. For this little girl, it wasn't just about singing. It was about proving to herself that her voice mattered, that she could step into a world that often dismissed her as too young, too small, too insignificant, and show them something unforgettable. What she didn't know was that her courage was about to collide with destiny itself. Because Elvis Presley, the man whose songs had become the soundtrack of her childhood, would soon hear her sing them with his own ears. Meanwhile, in another part of town, Elvis was living a very different life, but one equally tied to moments like this. At this point in his career, Elvis was still larger than life, adored across the world. And yet, he often longed for reminders of where he came from. He knew what it was like to be dismissed, to be underestimated, to have people laugh at him before they applauded. That's why stories about children, especially children with music in their hearts, always drew his attention. He remembered being that boy from Tupelo with nothing but a guitar and a dream. And when he heard whispers that a young girl could sing his songs with uncanny power, he grew curious. Elvis had a habit, one that wasn't widely known. He would sometimes slip quietly into places in disguise or without announcement just to see real people, real music without the glare of fame. He wanted to be reminded of the humanity behind the applause. And so, as this little girl prepared for the biggest moment of her young life, Elvis Presley himself was preparing, unknowingly, to walk into hers. The threads of their stories were pulling closer together. She, trembling but determined, practicing night after night in a modest home filled with the echoes of Elvis records. He, restless and searching, drawn by whispers of a child who could sing with the purity and power he once had. Neither of them knew what was about to happen when those two worlds collided. But when they did, when the voice of a 7-year-old met the heart of a king, it would leave everyone present stunned. And it was all about to unfold. The night of the talent showcase arrived. The air buzzed with chatter as families filled the small community hall, its wooden floors creaking beneath the weight of folding chairs and restless feet. It wasn't a glamorous venue, not the kind of place you'd expect a story that would one day become legend to begin. But sometimes the most extraordinary moments happen in the most ordinary rooms. Backstage, the little girl's stomach churned. Her bow was slightly crooked, her hands clammy, her eyes darting to the door every few seconds as if she might still run out. She heard the laughter of other children, the polite applause for a juggling act, the rhythmic claps as a boy tapped out a dance routine. Her turn was coming, and the weight of it pressed down on her tiny shoulders. She whispered to herself the same words her father had told her countless times. If Elvis could sing through the fear, so can you. But as her name was called, her knees nearly buckled. The walk from backstage to the microphone felt like a mile-long journey. And when she finally stood there, staring out at rows of strangers, her throat tightened. For a heartbeat, the hall was too big, the silence too heavy. Would she freeze or find her voice? The piano chords began, familiar, warm, like the opening lines of a lullaby she had known her whole life. Can't help falling in love. The first note trembled, nearly lost. But then something shifted. She closed her eyes, took a breath, and let her voice pour out, not timid, not uncertain, but strong. The hall grew silent. Children stopped whispering, parents leaned forward. Her small frame seemed almost too fragile to carry such power, but her voice soared anyway, steady and haunting. At first, the audience was surprised. Then they were spellbound. They weren't hearing a child trying to mimic Elvis. They were hearing a child channel something deeper, every note laced with innocence, with honesty, with the kind of purity that stripped the song down to its beating heart. By the time she reached the chorus, the atmosphere had changed. The air itself felt heavier, charged, as though everyone knew they were witnessing something rare. And in the back of the hall, someone else had just slipped quietly into the room. Dressed simply, his presence unnoticed at first, Elvis Presley himself had walked in. He had heard the whispers, the rumors about this little girl, but nothing could have prepared him for this. He stood against the wall, arms crossed, watching her. At first, he wore a small smile, amused by the idea of a child singing his music. But within seconds, the smile faded into something else, something deeper. His eyes softened. He leaned forward, caught in the spell like everyone else. The little girl had no idea. To her, this was still just a crowd of strangers. Her father in the front row, her mother clutching her hands, and a sea of faces staring up at her. She didn't know the king was among them, silently listening, silently moved. And that ignorance freed her. She sang without restraint, pouring every ounce of herself into the words, and with every verse the tension in the room thickened. Would she make it through without faltering, or would the weight of the moment break her? For a brief second, her voice cracked. The nerves caught up, her throat tightening midline, gasps rippled through the audience. A child, after all, was still a child. But she pushed forward. She remembered her father's story of Elvis being laughed at, doubted, and dismissed. She steadied herself, took another breath, and came back stronger, her voice ringing clearer than before. That stumble made the moment even more powerful. The audience didn't just hear her talent, they saw her courage. They saw her refuse to give in. And in that defiance, the performance became more than a song. It became a story unfolding in real time. And still, she didn't know. Elvis Presley, the very man whose music she was carrying, was just yards away, his expression shifting from awe to something close to pride. What would happen when the song ended, when their worlds collided? As she sang the final line, the hall erupted. Applause thundered through the room, louder than any other performance that night. Some parents wiped away tears, children clapped furiously. Her own mother sobbed openly, her father's hands raised high in applause. The little girl's eyes widened in disbelief. She had expected polite clapping at best, maybe even silence. But this was overwhelming. She smiled shyly, curtsied the way her mother had taught her, and prepared to walk off stage. That's when it happened. The applause didn't stop. It grew louder, stronger, as if the crowd was demanding something more. And then, from the back of the hall, a man stepped forward. Slowly, deliberately, the clapping shifted into a rhythm that carried across the room. People began turning, whispering, realizing who it was. Elvis Presley. The hall gasped as recognition spread like fire. The king of rock and roll himself was standing among them, clapping for a 7-year-old girl who had just sung his song. The little girl froze. She couldn't believe what her eyes were telling her. Elvis, here applauding her, her knees shook, her heart raced, her breath caught in her throat. What would Elvis do next? Stay silent in admiration or step into the spotlight with her? He didn't hesitate. With that slow, confident stride the world knew so well, Elvis walked to the front of the room. The audience parted like the Red Sea, whispers trailing in his wake. He reached the stage, looked up at the child who was still frozen in place, and extended his hand. "Sing another one," he said gently, his voice carrying enough to hush the hall. The little girl blinked, stunned, another one with him standing right there. The crowd roared with anticipation. Parents lifted their children to see. Reporters scribbled furiously, knowing they were witnessing something they'd be writing about for years. And there she stood, a 7-year-old trembling with awe, her childhood hero right in front of her, asking her to sing again. The tension was unbearable. Would she find her voice one more time, or collapse under the unimaginable pressure of singing in front of the man himself? The hall lined in, breathless, waiting for her answer. She opened her mouth, and the story would never be the same again. The hall had already been electric with applause, but when Elvis Presley himself stepped forward, the energy shifted into something indescribable. It was no longer just a community showcase. It was history in the making. The little girl stood frozen at the microphone, her small frame trembling as the king of rock and roll looked up at her. His presence alone was overwhelming, tall, confident, his dark hair catching the glow of the stage lights. But there was no arrogance in his eyes, only warmth. "Sing another one," Elvis said again, his voice low and steady, carrying across the hushed room. The audience erupted, a mix of cheers, gasps, and disbelief. Some people clapped wildly, others simply stared, unable to process what they were witnessing. For the girl, the world blurred. Her heart pounded so loudly in her chest it felt like it might drown out everything else. She wanted to run, she wanted to hide. But then she saw the way Elvis was looking at her, not with the impatience of a superstar, not with the pride of ownership, but with encouragement. Like a father urging his child forward, like a mentor waiting for the student to take their first brave step. So she nodded just once. And the pianist, realizing what was about to unfold, lifted his hands again to the keys. This time it was Love Me Tender, a song so deeply tied to Elvis's own identity, sung countless times on grand stages, in stadiums, on television broadcasts. But never like this. Never through the voice of a child trembling yet determined to sing for the man who had made the world fall in love with it. The first words slipped out, softer this time. The little girl's voice quivered, nearly breaking under the weight of the moment. But then, as she glanced at Elvis again, she saw him nodding, tapping his foot gently, his lips curling into the faintest smile. It steadied her. She sang louder, clearer, and as her voice grew, something extraordinary happened. Elvis began to hum along. At first, it was barely audible, just a low vibration beneath her melody. But then, as the chorus arrived, his voice rose, unmistakable and rich. The king of rock and roll was no longer just a spectator. He was her partner. The audience gasped, some people leapt to their feet. Parents pulled their children closer, whispering, "Remember this moment, you'll never see anything like it again." Side by side, one voice innocent and bright, the other seasoned and iconic, they sang. The child pouring her heart out, the king weaving his legendary tones around hers, creating a harmony so unexpected it gave everyone in the room chills. By the second verse, tears streaked down faces in the audience. Reporters scribbled with frantic hands, trying to capture words that could never truly capture the magic. This wasn't just a duet. It was a passing of spirit, a bridge between generations. And in that moment, Elvis wasn't the global superstar, the legend, the untouchable king. He was simply a man, humbled and inspired by the courage of a child who dared to sing his songs. When the final note hung in the air, the room exploded. The applause was deafening, echoing off the walls, rattling the wooden floors beneath their feet. People shouted, clapped, whistled, cheered. Some cried openly. The little girl stood in shock, her chest rising and falling as if she had just run a marathon. Elvis turned to her, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. The crowd fell quiet again, desperate to hear what he would say. "You've got a gift, sweetheart," he said softly, his southern drawl wrapping around each word. "Don't ever let anyone tell you you're too small to share it. You just reminded me why I started singing in the first place." The room held its breath. Elvis Presley, the man who had sold millions of records, performed for presidents, and stood at the center of global fame, had just admitted that a 7-year-old girl reminded him of his own beginnings. The girl's eyes filled with tears. She couldn't find words, so she simply nodded, her lips trembling into a shy smile. And then Elvis did something no one expected. He knelt slightly, bringing himself to her level, and whispered, "Promise me you'll keep singing." The crowd erupted again, but this time it wasn't applause. It was awe, because they weren't just watching a performance. They were witnessing Elvis Presley pass down something more profound than a melody. He was passing down belief, the belief that music mattered, that courage mattered, that even the smallest voice could touch the largest hearts. The little girl whispered back, "I promise." The king smiled, stood, and turned back to the audience. Raising her hand in his, he lifted it high like a champion being crowned. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "this is what music is all about." The ovation thundered again, shaking the walls. Some said the applause lasted longer than any encore they had ever heard at one of Elvis's concerts. From that moment, the hall wasn't just a community center anymore. It was sacred ground to those who had been there. Parents told their children, reporters wrote feverishly, and whispers spread across town. Elvis Presley had walked into a talent show and found himself stunned by a child. That night, the little girl went home still dazed, clutching the memory like a secret too precious to speak aloud. She couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his smile, heard his words, felt the weight of his hand on her shoulder. She knew nothing in her life would ever feel the same again. And for Elvis, the moment lingered too. The king who had conquered stages and stadiums, who had lived under the relentless eye of fame, had been reminded in the purest way possible why music mattered. It wasn't about lights or records or headlines. It was about connection, about a little girl who dared to sing with her whole heart. That night became a turning point, for her, for him, and for everyone lucky enough to be in that small hall when innocence met greatness, and the king chose to sing not above her but beside her. It was the kind of moment that doesn't just fade into memory, it becomes legend. When the last echoes of applause finally faded, the hall felt forever changed. Parents still clutched their children close, murmuring that they had witnessed something no words could ever fully capture. Reporters, their notepads scribbled with half-finished sentences, knew they had a story that would ripple far beyond the small town. And at the center of it all stood a 7-year-old girl who could hardly comprehend what had just unfolded. She hadn't just sung, she had shared the stage with Elvis Presley. As she stepped down, her legs shaking, Elvis leaned close once more. "Don't forget," he whispered, "this is only the beginning." His hand gave hers a gentle squeeze before he let go, leaving her with both comfort and responsibility in equal measure. For the audience, the weight of the moment lingered. Some cried openly, moved not just by the child's bravery but by Elvis's humility. Others clapped long after their hands ached, unwilling to let the magic dissolve into silence. Even those who had come with no expectations at all left with stories they would tell for decades. The news spread quickly. By the next morning, word of Elvis's surprise appearance at a community talent show had reached local newspapers. Headlines ran with variations of the same astonished truth. "The king applauds a child prodigy." One article described it as a passing of the torch, while another called it the most human moment in Presley's career. But beyond the ink and paper, what mattered most was the ripple in people's hearts. Fans who read the story didn't just marvel at the girl's courage. They marveled at Elvis. Because once again, he had shown himself not just as an entertainer, but as a man who cared deeply about music in its purest form. For the girl, the aftermath was overwhelming. In the days that followed, neighbors knocked on her family's door, bringing flowers, letters, and small gifts. Teachers stopped her in the hallway, their voices hushed with reverence, saying they had read about her in the paper. Children who once teased her for loving old music now begged her to sing again at recess. But with the admiration came pressure. She was only 7, still learning multiplication tables, still playing with dolls. And yet everywhere she went, people asked, "What's next?" Some expected her to become famous overnight. Others doubted the moment would last. That weight, heavy and unfair, pressed against her innocence. Her parents did their best to shield her. They reminded her of Elvis's words that this was only the beginning, not the end. They encouraged her to keep singing but to stay a child first, to hold on to the joy of music, not the burden of expectation. Elvis himself spoke about the event quietly in the days after. To friends, he admitted he had been shaken not in fear but in awe. She sang like she meant it, he told one confidant. It reminded me of when I was young, when it wasn't about the spotlight, when it was just about the song. That honesty revealed something profound. By the 1970s, Elvis was already a legend, but he was also weary of fame's weight. He had been on stages where screams drowned out his own voice, where lights blinded him from ever truly seeing his audience. But that small hall, that trembling child, it pierced through the noise. It reminded him of the boy he used to be in Tupelo, Mississippi, poor, overlooked, singing with nothing but hope in his chest. And perhaps that was why his reaction had been so moving, because Elvis wasn't just applauding her, he was thanking her. The fans, too, felt the impact. Letters poured into his offices, praising him for his humility and kindness. Some fans wrote that they cried when they read about the duet, imagining their own children in her place. Others said the story made them fall in love with Elvis all over again, not as a superstar, but as a man who had never forgotten the power of music to heal, to connect, to uplift. As weeks passed, the legend grew. Each retelling added new colors, but the heart of it remained the same. A little girl had dared to sing, and Elvis Presley had not only listened but joined her. That narrative carried power because it wasn't about perfection. It was about humanity. For the girl, the lesson endured. She didn't become a global superstar overnight, but she carried Elvis's words like a secret treasure. Don't ever let anyone tell you you're too small to share it. Every time doubt crept back in, she remembered the way his eyes had met hers, steady and encouraging. And she sang, sometimes for crowds, sometimes just in her bedroom, but always with courage. The long-term effect was subtle but profound. In her town, children who once felt too small to dream began signing up for talent shows too. Parents reminded their kids of the girl who sang for Elvis, saying, "See, anything is possible." And within the Presley fan community, the story became almost mythical, the king stepping out of the shadows to remind the world that greatness can be found in the unlikeliest of places. Even for Elvis, the night remained lodged in his memory. Friends later recalled him retelling the story with a softness in his voice, almost wistful. It wasn't the grandeur of Las Vegas shows he lingered on, nor the roaring crowds at stadiums. It was the small hall, the trembling child, and the reminder that music only truly mattered when it came from the heart. That's what made the moment legendary. It wasn't just about shock, Elvis showing up unannounced, the king singing with a child. It was about what it revealed, that no matter how famous, no matter how powerful, Elvis Presley never lost sight of the power of kindness, humility, and encouragement. And that's why the story has endured. Not because of the stage, not because of the headlines, but because of the image it left behind. A man known as the king lowering himself to stand beside a little girl, reminding her and everyone watching that greatness isn't about standing above others. It's about lifting them up. In the end, the night gave more than a memory. It gave a lesson. For the girl, it was proof that her voice mattered. For the fans, it was a reminder that Elvis's heart was as great as his talent. And for Elvis himself, it was a spark, a moment of clarity that no matter how big the stages became, the smallest, most honest voices could still move him. The aftermath was not scandalous nor dramatic. It was quiet, almost sacred. But in that quietness lay its power. Because sometimes the most unforgettable legacies are not built on spectacle but on compassion. And so the story of a 7-year-old girl singing Elvis Presley songs and the king's shocking response lived on. Not as gossip, not as a headline, but as a truth passed down that music belongs to everyone and that even the greatest voices are never too great to sing alongside the smallest. Years passed, but that night in the small community hall never faded. For those who had been there, it became the story they told at kitchen tables, at family gatherings, and even to strangers who would listen. The night a 7-year-old sang Elvis Presley's songs, and the king himself stood beside her. But what made the story live on wasn't just its shock value. It wasn't only that Elvis had appeared unannounced or that he had sung alongside a child. The real reason it endured was what it revealed, about Elvis, about music, and about the power of a single moment to shape lives far beyond the walls where it happened. For the little girl, the legacy was deeply personal. Though she grew older and her life took new directions, she never forgot the feeling of Elvis's hand resting on her shoulder, the sound of his voice blending with hers, and the words he whispered. This is only the beginning. Those words became a compass. Whenever she doubted herself, whenever she felt too small or unheard, she returned to that night and remembered that even the king of rock and roll had believed in her. She didn't chase fame the way some expected. She didn't become a global superstar or fill stadiums with screaming fans. But she carried the gift of that night into everything she did. Whether singing in church, teaching her own children the power of music, or simply reminding a friend that their voice mattered, she lived out the lesson Elvis had given her. In her life, the legacy of that moment was not about glory but about courage, the courage to share her voice no matter how small. For Elvis, the legacy took on a different shape. The world remembered him for his records, his films, his iconic concerts. But stories like this one painted a more human picture of the man behind the legend. They reminded fans that beneath the glittering jumpsuits and roaring crowds, Elvis never forgot where he came from. He never forgot what it was like to be underestimated, to be the boy from Tupelo with a dream bigger than anyone thought possible. That night reaffirmed something he already believed. Greatness isn't measured by how many people bow before you, but by how many people you lift up. And so, when fans retold this story, they weren't just celebrating his music, they were celebrating his heart. The fans themselves carried this moment like a treasure. In fan clubs, at conventions, in letters exchanged across the world, the story became almost mythic. It wasn't staged, it wasn't rehearsed, it was pure. Fans would whisper it to newcomers. Did you hear about the time Elvis sang with a child? Did you hear what he told her? And every time the story was shared, it drew people closer not just to Elvis the performer, but to Elvis the person. That's the power of legacy. It's not always the grand gestures or the world tour that define a life. Sometimes it's a fleeting act of kindness, a few words spoken to a trembling child that ripple outward across time. But the legacy didn't stop with Elvis or the girl or even the fans who spread the tale. It extended into something larger, a reminder of what music is truly for. In an age when fame can often overshadow authenticity, this story pulls us back to the truth that music is about connection. It's about the courage of a child, the humility of a legend, and the way their voices met in harmony for a brief, unforgettable moment. Generations later, people who weren't even alive when it happened still find themselves moved by it. They read about it, they hear whispers of it, and they feel something stir inside them. Because deep down, everyone longs to believe that greatness notices the small. That legends don't just shine alone, but share their light with others. And perhaps that is why this story refuses to fade. It's not just about Elvis, it's about us. About the hope that our own voices, no matter how small, can matter, that our own moments, however fleeting, can ripple into something lasting. The reflection goes even further. When people think about Elvis Presley, they often picture the glamour, the Vegas lights, the jumpsuits, the screaming crowds. But when they hear this story, they see something else, a man kneeling to encourage a child. A king who didn't need to remind the world of his crown, but chose instead to remind a little girl of her worth. And that changes how people remember him. It softens the legend, makes him accessible, relatable. It shows that his greatest performances weren't always the ones recorded on vinyl or broadcast on television. Sometimes, his greatest performances happened in quiet rooms, in unscripted moments, when he chose compassion over spectacle. That is why this story remains stitched into the fabric of Elvis's legacy. It's not a concert, it's not a record, it's a lesson. A reminder that even the most famous man in the world once paused everything to honor the courage of a child. And what about us, those who listen, who retell, who carry the story forward? The legacy becomes ours too, because in hearing it, we are challenged. Do we see the small voices around us? Do we encourage them? Do we remind others that they matter even when they doubt themselves? Elvis's choice that night wasn't just a gesture of kindness. It was a call to all of us to live the same way. So when people say the story is unforgettable, it's not only because Elvis Presley was involved. It's because it awakens something inside. It reminds us that greatness is not about power but about presence. Not about towering over others, but about kneeling beside them. For the little girl, that night became a guiding star. For Elvis, it was a mirror reflecting the boy he once was. For the fans, it was proof that their king's heart was as big as his talent. And for us, it's a story we keep telling because it reminds us who we want to be. The legacy is layered, it is tender, it is enduring. And every time the story is told, Elvis's words echo again, don't ever let anyone tell you you're too small to share it. In the end, that's the true inheritance. Not just the memory of a duet in a small hall, but the belief that every voice matters, every moment can carry weight, and every act of kindness has the power to become legend. And that's why decades later, the night a 7-year-old girl sang Elvis Presley's song still resonates, because it wasn't just about the king. It was about the kingdom he left behind, a kingdom built not of gold or fame, but of humanity, humility, and the kind of love that lingers long after the music fades. Time has a way of turning moments into memories and memories into legends. And yet, some stories never fade at all, they live on as if they are happening still, because of the way they touch the human heart. The night a 7-year-old girl sang Elvis Presley's songs and the king himself walked forward not as a superstar but as a fellow soul moved to tears is one of those stories. It wasn't rehearsed, it wasn't staged, it wasn't planned for headlines or cameras, it was real. And maybe that's why people remember it so vividly. Because in that brief collision of innocence and greatness, we saw something rare, humility in its purest form. Elvis didn't just applaud a child. He didn't just join her in song. He gave her his belief. And in doing so, he gave all of us a reminder of what truly matters. When we look back on Elvis's life, it's easy to focus on the glittering lights, the sold-out arenas, the global fame. But the true measure of his legacy often shines brightest in moments like this, small, quiet, and deeply human. A child trembling with fear, a man who had conquered the world leaning down to whisper, "You matter, your voice matters." That single act echoes louder than any stage pyrotechnics or roaring crowd, because fame fades, headlines fade, but kindness endures. And maybe that's the lesson this story leaves behind. We are all in some way both the child and the king. We are all small voices longing to be heard. And we are all powerful enough to lift someone else higher, to remind them of their worth, to leave behind something greater than ourselves. Think about it, a girl of 7 with no fame, no fortune, no spotlight, just courage, managed to move Elvis Presley himself. And Elvis, a man whose name still towers over music history, chose not to protect his pedestal but to step down and share it. That is why this story matters, because it shows us that greatness is never about standing alone at the top. It's about reaching down, taking someone's hand, and bringing them up beside you. Even now, decades later, the retelling of that night sparks something in us. It makes us pause. It makes us believe again in innocence, in humility, in the power of a single voice. And isn't that what Elvis's music was always about? Songs that made people feel less alone, less small, more alive. Songs that turned ordinary moments into extraordinary ones. The hall where it happened no longer looks the same. The chairs have been moved, the walls repainted, time has washed over it as it does all things. But for those who were there when they closed their eyes, they can still hear it. A trembling child's voice, a king's harmony, and the sound of a crowd realizing they were in the presence of something unforgettable. And maybe that's the point of legacy. Not that it remains frozen in stone, but that it breathes inside the people who carry it. That little girl carried it, the fans carried it, Elvis carried it, and now so do we. So the next time you doubt yourself, the next time you wonder if your voice is too small or your dreams too distant, remember this. Elvis Presley once stopped the world for a 7-year-old who dared to sing. And if her voice mattered then, yours matters now. That is the heart of this story, that is the gift it leaves behind. And if this moment moved you, if you felt even a fraction of the awe that swept through that hall, I invite you to stay with us. Because there are countless more untold stories of Elvis, stories not just of fame and music, but of humanity, compassion, and the ways he touched lives in unexpected corners of the world. Stories like the time he stopped an entire concert for one fan in the crowd, or the night he walked into his own hotel in disguise and taught a lesson that changed the entire hospitality industry. These are the moments that show us not just the legend, but the man. So don't miss them. Join us, subscribe, and continue this journey as we uncover more of the king's untold truths. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder of courage and kindness. And if you want to feel the same goosebumps again, stay with us because the next story might just move you even more. For now, let's leave this night as it was meant to be remembered. A small child with a big voice, and a king who chose to sing beside her. Because in the end, Elvis Presley's greatest legacy wasn't just music. It was moments like this, moments that reminded the world of the power of humility, the beauty of innocence, and the eternal truth that sometimes the smallest voices create the loudest echoes. And so we close not with a farewell, but with an invitation. To carry this story with you, to believe in the strength of your own voice, and to never forget that even legends kneel to encourage the next generation. This is the story of a girl, a song, and a king. And though the music faded that night, the echo has never stopped.